John Scott was born in 1798 on his parents' farm, located in what was then western Orange County, North Carolina. He was one of 7 children born to Samuel and Nancy Bryan Scott and was their oldest son. He was born 15 years after the American Revolution ended and died a few years before the Civil War began. John was an interesting person, and we are fortunate to know so much about him. He lived during a period of rapid change, some of which was of his own making. But more about that later. John married a local girl named Margaret Anderson in 1820, and by 1834, when their last child was born, their family consisted of 5 daughters and 3 sons. A family Bible indicates that John and Margaret moved house several times during the early part of their marriage. 3 of their children were listed as being born in a place called Scottsville. John was the postmaster of Scottsville until 1845, when the post office was moved to another location. Like his father Samuel and his younger brother Henderson, John was a prosperous merchant and farmer. He was a leader in Graham Presbyterian Church and served as an elder of that institution. When their father, Samuel Scott, died in 1841, John and Henderson were named the executors. Samuel left behind much property and many assets, and in addition to these duties, John was named conservator for his younger sister Hannah Murphy and her children. Around the time John had reached his 50th birthday, something happened that would change his life and the lives of his family forever. In 1849, the North Carolina Assembly voted to create a new county, which would be named Alamance. The land that the new county occupied would be taken from the western side of Orange County, where John and his family resided. The eastern border would lie 9 miles west of Hillsborough. This decision was not exactly a surprise. Travel to and from Hillsborough could be arduous back then, as none of the roads were paved and there were no bridges over the waterways. Of course, a new county would be a boon to the people of the Hawfields. But how do you build a new county from the ground up? We don't know today if John was surprised when he was selected to be one of the 9 commissioners of the new county, but we do know that he took his responsibilities seriously. The commissioner's first task would be to select a name and location for the new county seat. It was decided to locate the county seat in, or at least as near as possible, to the geographical center of Alamance County. The commissioners arranged to purchase 75 acres for the new town, which they named Graham, in honor of William A. Graham, who was the governor of North Carolina from 1845 to 1849. A portion of the 75 acres was surveyed, resulting in 68 mostly square lots, arranged in a formal grid around the spot where the new courthouse would be built. The roads leading away from the court square, as it was called, were given colloquial names, but were not in fact named officially until 1897. Court business was held at the Providence Christian Church until the courthouse could be completed. John was one of the first buyers of land in the new town, purchasing lot 52, 53, 63, 63 and a half, and 64 at the auction which took place in 1851. He built a 3-room log cabin on lot 63 and moved in as soon as it was practical. At that time, his household included his wife, his younger children, his unmarried sister Fanny, and several servants. John Scott was a merchant and also Graham's first magistrate of police, an office corresponding to mayor. He built the first general store in Graham. It was located south of Court Square, across the street from the well-known W.J. Nix building. On December 8, 1850, John opened his home to a group of parishioners recently sent from their home church, Graham Presbyterian, to form a new church to be named Graham Presbyterian Church. Their names appear in the minutes taken during the session meeting. John Scott was the first elder of the new congregation. The church grew and prospered over the years and was remodeled several times, resulting in the impressive structure that we see today. A series of letters sent from John and his extended family in the Hawfields to relatives in Arkansas give us a sense of life at that time. On October 10th, 1853, John wrote the following.
Dear nephew, we are well at present. Your Aunt Peggy has enjoyed fine health this summer, whereas mine hasn't been good. Your Aunt Peggy has gone over to Hawfields with the Moore family and are camping there, and have left me to keep the house. I look forward to them home Tuesday evening or Wednesday. We have fine weather for the meeting. James Sidney, Calvin, and John Dixon have gone to the upper part of the state to select places to sell goods. Calvin and John Dixon are going to business together. Myself and James Sidney are talking of putting a clothing store in Greensboro. Myself and Leonidas will still do business in Graham. We're too many to be all in one place like Graham. Our railroad is progressing finely. When we get a road to Memphis, I hope I may take a ride to see you.
As things turned out, John never saw his nephew again. John died 3 years later on April 21st, 1856, and was buried among his ancestors in the cemetery of Hawfields Presbyterian Church. His grave marker reads, John Scott of Graham, and is a fitting tribute to someone who did so much to get Graham started. Despite John's talk of his sons relocating, most of John and Margaret's children decided to stay on in Graham, buying up more land, building houses, and starting new businesses. They married and started families of their own. James Sidney Scott was particularly ambitious. He opened a general store with his brother-in-law, Calvin Donnell. The store was so profitable, the two partners decided to build a cotton mill with some of the profits. The mill, which was named the Scott and Donnell Cotton Manufactory, was completed in 1882 and sold to Lynn Banks Holt in 1887, who renamed it the Oneida Cotton Mill. James Sidney built a second cotton mill in a location north of town. The building, which still stands today, was named the Sidney Cotton Mills. John's youngest son, John Leonidas, or Lug as he was called, was also a merchant. His store was located on the corner of Courthouse Square next to the original site of the First National Bank of Alamance. Margaret Scott outlived her husband by some 30 years. She retired to a tidy cottage that was built for her by her son James Sidney on a corner of the property where he lived with his wife, children, and brother-in-law. We can glean a sense of Margaret's life as a widow from the writings of Sally Stockard, who was John and Margaret's great-granddaughter. A biography by the historian Carol Troxler includes many of Sally's memories of her childhood. Sally was an unusually studious child who was determined to get a good education. When the time came for her to attend high school, she was sent to stay with her maternal grandparents, John Gibbs Albright and Nancy Jane Scott Albright. Sally spent time with her great-grandmother Margaret, especially on Sunday mornings when she fixed a hearty breakfast for the old lady. Sally would go on to get a fine education and was the first female student to complete a bachelor's degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. 2 years later, in 1900, she received her master's degree from the same institution. Fittingly, the title of her master's thesis was The History of Alamance. The thesis was published in book form the same year she graduated. We can picture Sally visiting the old courthouse in Graham to gather information for her work. Many of the descendants of John and Margaret Scott still live in Graham. Over the many generations, they have contributed much to the growth and success of their hometown. There is no doubt that the enterprising spirit they inherited from John and Margaret is alive and well to this day.